Your body remembers everything your mind was told to forget. It remembers the specific quality of silence in a house where silence was never entirely safe. The kind that had a texture to it, a weight, a low and unspoken electricity that the child you will learn to read before they learn to read words. It remembers the way your shoulders rose almost imperceptibly whenever a certain door opened, or a certain voice changed register, or the air in the room shifted in that particular way that meant something was about to happen. It remembers the shallow breathing, the held jaw, the stomach that learned to tighten like a fist before the mind had even finished registering a threat. You did not decide to become a watchful child. Watchfulness was not a personality trait you chose from some available menu of ways to be. It was the most intelligent response available to a nervous system that had gathered, from the evidence of its environment, that the world required close and constant monitoring, that the adults in the room could not be fully predicted. That safety was not a baseline condition, but something that had to be continuously assessed, earned, maintained through vigilance. And so you watched, you listened, you calibrated your presence to the shifting emotional weather of everyone around you with a precision that should have been extraordinary to witness, except that no one was watching you closely enough to witness it. This is an essay about what that watching costs, not in the abstract, psychological sense that we speak of emotional damage, but in the deeply literal, physical, embodied sense. The body that carried your childhood is still carrying it. The nervous system that learned to brace for storms in rooms that are long behind you is still bracing, still scanning, still administering its old and faithful protocols into a present that has changed around it. The watchful child grows up, but the watching does not stop. And this is the conversation we have been waiting to have. Hongromulars, the child who read every room on the exhausting brilliance of early vigilance. There is a kind of child who never fully arrives in any room, because some part of them is always in the doorway, assessing. They enter a space, and before they have set down their bag or taken off their coat, they have already gathered an enormous amount of information about the mood of each adult present, about the particular quality of the silence or the conversation, about where the emotional pressure is concentrated, and which direction it is most likely to move. They have done this so quickly and so automatically that they experience it not as assessment, but as simply the felt sense of a room. This child notices the slight flattening in a parent's voice that precedes withdrawal. They notice the particular quality of laughter that is covering tension rather than expressing ease. They notice when the smile does not reach the eyes. They notice when the atmosphere has a charge to it that everyone else seems to be pretending not to feel, and they navigate that charge with the careful, unhurried attention of someone crossing a floor they are not entirely sure will hold. Picture them at the dinner table, body turned slightly toward the most unpredictable adult, fork moving automatically while attention is allocated almost entirely to monitoring. They are not tasting the food. They are listening, with the full instrument of their body, to the tone of the conversation 3 exchanges ahead of the one that is currently happening. Picture them in bed at night, not yet asleep, holding a particular kind of wakefulness. One that is not the wakefulness of excitement or curiosity, but the wakefulness of a sentry, tracking the sounds of the house, interpreting the specific creak of a floorboard, the rise of a voice, the sudden silence that follows a raised one. This is not a dramatic childhood, necessarily. It may contain no single defining crisis, no obvious trauma that announces itself. It is a childhood of chronic ambient alertness, a childhood in which the baseline state of the nervous system was never quite allowed to settle into ease. And in the body of a child whose nervous system is still developing, still learning what the world is and what it requires, this chronic alertness is not an intermittent response to an intermittent threat. It becomes the default setting, the permanent posture, the interior weather that the child comes to experience as simply weather, not knowing that other people's weather runs at a different temperature entirely. Han Grådelandsros. The home that required constant translation, on emotional environments that could not be trusted to stay still. The homes that produce the watchful child are not exclusively homes of obvious instability. Sometimes they are homes where a parent's moods were genuinely unpredictable, where emotional volatility created an atmosphere that fluctuated between warmth and cold with little apparent logic. But just as often, they are homes that were outwardly functional, even outwardly admirable, but internally organized around an emotional atmosphere the child could not quite decipher or trust. A home with an adult whose emotional life was large and uncontained, who brought the weather of their own unprocessed pain into every shared space and expected the household to accommodate it. A home where love was present but erratic, where affection arrived in warm floods and then receded without explanation into a coolness that the child invariably interpreted as their fault. A home where conflict was perpetually present, just below the surface of things, where the adults maintained a careful and exhausting truce that the children could feel in the pressure of every quiet meal. In all of these environments, the child's surveillance was not paranoia. It was the only available form of preparation. If you can see the storm coming early enough, you can get out of its path. If you can read the emotional temperature of the room accurately enough, you can adjust your behavior in time to prevent the worst of the damage. So the child becomes a translator of adults. They become fluent in the unspoken, in the sigh that means withdrawal, in the particular silence that precedes an outburst, in the careful management of their own presence so as to remain invisible to the parts of the adult that were most likely to cause harm. And in the process, something necessary is lost. The child's relationship to their own inner life becomes secondary to their management of everyone else's. They are so occupied with external surveillance that the internal landscape goes largely unattended. Their own feelings, their own needs, their own emerging understanding of who they are and what want, all become quieter and quieter in the background of the endless, exhausting task of reading the room. This is where the loneliness of the watchful child lives. Not in the absence of people, but in the perpetual, necessary absence of self. Hanungloras, the body that never got the all clear on the biology of a nervous system that never learned to rest. Here is what happens physiologically when a child's nervous system is required to maintain chronic alertness over months and years of development. The body's stress response system, designed to activate in the presence of genuine threat and then return to baseline when the threat has passed, never receives the signal to return. The all clear never comes. And so the system stays activated, administering its protocols in a continuous, low-grade emergency that the child eventually experiences simply as the texture of normal life. The physiological signatures of this are real and measurable. Elevated baseline cortisol, the stress hormone, in children raised in unpredictable, emotionally charged environments. Heightened activity in the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, which in watchful children learns to scan for social and emotional threat, with the same urgency it would scan for physical danger. Changes in the autonomic nervous system, the branch that governs the body's automatic functions, that keep the system tilted towards sympathetic activation, toward the ready state of fight or flight, rather than settling into the parasympathetic ease of genuine rest. In the body, this registers as the chronic tension that becomes invisible because it has always been there. The tight shoulders that the person assumes are simply how their body feels. The shallow upper chest breathing that never quite reaches the belly, as though the body has learned to take only what it needs and leave the rest, to be as unobtrusive as possible in its own physicality. The stomach that moves through the day in a mild but constant state of contraction, as though braced for impact that may or may not arrive. Shame, too, writes itself into the body in this history. The child who is told, explicitly or through atmospheric implication, that their anxiety is excessive, that their vigilance is a burden, that their need for reassurance is somehow too much, learns to experience their own nervous system as a deficiency. The shame about being anxious becomes layered on top of the anxiety itself, creating a compound burden. Not only am I afraid, but I am wrong to be afraid, and my being afraid makes things worse. And so I must manage even my fear in secret, alone, without the relief of having it witnessed. The body carries all of this, without complaint, without announcement, with the extraordinary patience of a container that has never been shown a different option. Hanbulang, the exhausted adult in the capable body on the cost of lifelong vigilance in the landscape of daily life. Watchful child becomes a particular kind of adult. From the outside, they often appear remarkably composed, attuned to others, sensitive to atmosphere, capable of reading social and emotional dynamics with a speed and accuracy that others find almost uncanny. They are frequently the person in the room who notices what no one else has yet named. They are good in a crisis, steady under pressure, reliable in the specific way of someone who has spent a lifetime in low-grade preparation. But underneath that composure, the body working extraordinarily hard. It is still running the old surveillance program, scanning, assessing, calibrating, bracing, in every environment it enters, including environments that are genuinely safe. The nervous system does not distinguish automatically between the room that required vigilance and the room that does not. It applies its training universally, faithfully, with a consistency that is both its greatest adaptation and its greatest cost. The physical toll manifests in ways that the person often does not connect to their history. Chronic headaches that arrive without obvious cause. Digestive disturbance that seems to have no dietary explanation. Sleep that is technically present but never feels fully restorative, as though the body stays partly awake even in sleep, maintaining a watchful readiness that rest should dissolve but doesn't. Muscle tension that accumulates in the neck and shoulders and jaw and lower back, not as the result of any single stressor, but as the cumulative deposit of years of unprocessed alertness held quietly in the tissues. Relationships carry the cost too, in their particular way. The hypervigilant adult tends to experience intimacy as a site of both profound longing and genuine physiological alarm. Being seen, truly, softly, without the armor of competence or composure, activates the same threat circuitry that was activated in childhood when visibility meant vulnerability. And so the body does what it learned to do. It contracts, it manages, it maintains a careful distance even inside the closest connections. Not out of lack of love, but out of the body's deeply trained understanding that closeness has historically required a price. They often do not know they are tired. They have been this tired for so long that the tiredness has become, like the vigilance, simply the baseline sensation of being alive. They move through their days carrying an invisible weight that no one can see because they have become so skilled at carrying it without visible strain. The moment the body speaks loudly enough on recognition as the first physical release there is, frequently a moment, in the life of the person who grew up watchful, when the body stops waiting and begins to insist. It may announce itself as a health event, a period of unexplained physical symptoms that the medical system cannot fully account for, a collapse of the immune system, a somatic crisis that demands attention and rest in the way that nothing the mind has tried to communicate has been able to demand it. Or it may arrive more quietly, a moment in therapy or in stillness when someone names the connection between what the body is doing now and what the child's body was required to do then, and something in the chest unlocks with a small, audible internal sound that is not quite a breath and not quite a cry, but is both. This is the recognition, and it matters enormously how it is held, because the first instinct for the person raised in vigilance is to treat this recognition as a new problem to be efficiently solved, to gather information about nervous system regulation, and implement the appropriate interventions to add healing to the list of things to be managed competently. This is the watchful child doing what they have always done, staying ahead of the problem, maintaining control, trusting effort over ease. But the body is not a problem to be solved. It is a companion to be befriended. And the healing it is asking for is not the healing of efficient intervention. It is the healing of patient, sustained attention, of finally being witnessed in the way the child inside this body needed to be witnessed, but wasn't, at great cost, for a very long time. Seeing the pattern is already a form of release. Understanding that the vigilance was not a personal failing, but a brilliant biological adaptation to a genuinely demanding environment. That the body was not broken, it was correct, it was doing exactly what it needed to do with the information it had. Changes something at the cellular level. The shame about the anxiety begins to lift, slowly, making room for something more accurate, respect, awe, even, for the extraordinary machine that carried you through circumstances it was never designed to endure alone. Havengrangre. The long return to the body on learning, at last, to live inside your own skin. The healing of the body that grew up watchful is not a return to some pre-vigilant innocence that never existed. It is something more honest and more possible than that. The gradual, patient re-education of a nervous system that received one very specific set of lessons about the world and is now being offered the chance to receive a different set. Not all at once, not through force or discipline or willpower, but through the quiet, repeated experience of safety. Safety in the body, in the breath, in the slowly expanding capacity to tolerate stillness without interpreting it as threat. Somatic practices. The slow and deliberate attention to what is happening in the body right now, in this breath, in this moment, are not supplementary to this healing. They are the site of it. Because the body is where the vigilance lives, and the body is where the release must happen. Not in the understanding of it, though understanding opens the door, but in the actual, lived, physical experience of breathing all the way down to the belly and feeling, with some surprise, that the world does not require you to brace. In learning to release the shoulders, slowly, consciously, not as a permanent fix, but as a practice, repeated enough times that the body begins to remember it is allowed to rest. In learning to sleep with the whole body rather than the half sleep of a sentry, which means first making peace with the anxiety that arises when vigilance is released, sitting with the nervous system's alarm that something has been left unmonitored, and staying, patiently and with enormous compassion, until the alarm discovers that there is nothing in this moment that requires attending to. In grieving, with the full weight of the grief it deserves, the childhood in which a young nervous system was required to do the work that should have belonged to the adults in the room, in honouring the body's extraordinary faithfulness, the way it protected you, managed you, carried you through every room that required vigilance, without asking for anything in return, without complaint, without the acknowledgement it was always owed. To the body that learned to brace before the first word was spoken, you are seen. What you did was not weakness. It was not disorder. It was loyalty. It was the profound, wordless loyalty of a body that loved the child inside it and did everything it could to keep them safe. You can put it down now, not all at once, not permanently, but in this breath, in this moment, in this one small returning to the ground beneath your feet. You can let the watching pause. You are already safe enough to begin learning what safe actually feels like. And that is where the rest of your life starts. Handholmrulers. If your body recognized something in these words before your mind did, trust that recognition. It is your own oldest intelligence finally being heard.